We've put together what we think is a dynamic program with some great experts on workplace safety. And as you know, workplace safety stories are so important that some of them end up winning awards, with the most recent example being Reuters, which won the George Polk Award for its reporting on child labor. For us, it's an honor that you've chosen to spend this time with us because at Kosh, we believe every worker should come home safely at the end of every shift, and journalists play a key role in shaping how we talk about workplace issues. Before we dive in to this 2-hour session, we have to give credit to your colleagues at the Center for Investigative Reporting. A few years back, they successfully sued OSHA, and as a result, the annual summaries of the OSHA 300 logs are now available to the public. You'll hear more about the OSHA 300 logs during this session, but basically, in summation, they're a log that details work-related injuries that private companies are required to report to the government. So this is just one of many data sources we'll discuss today. We'll be using the warehouse industry as an example in 2 of today's presentations, but the data we are highlighting can be used to look at any industry or company. We also have several resources we'll share with you following today's program. Our goal here today is to assist you by making data more transparent and easier to find. There's so much out there on different government websites, but it's not always easy to find, or it's not always clear what we're looking for and how to make sense of it. All right, with all that said, let's start the program. First up is Mireia Denise Zaragoza, a researcher from the Warehouse Worker Resource Center. Her work focuses on documenting the logistics and goods movement in Southern California and supporting organizational campaigns with strategic and legal research. The Warehouse Worker Resource Center is a nonprofit center in Southern California dedicated to improving working conditions across California's warehousing industry. Mireia?
Great, thank you so much, Melissa, for the great introduction. And while I share my screen, I want to say thank you to everyone who's here with us today, and I hope that you find this session helpful whether you are a new reporter or a reporter who's been doing this for a very long time. Can everyone see my screen? Awesome, okay. So for today's agenda, I will be mainly focusing on 2 types of data, qualitative and quantitative, and really highlighting the importance of when you're reporting on an industry. And the first part of my presentation will focus on how do you inform your data by talking to workers. And I will illustrate this by using a campaign as an example and 2 reports that demonstrate how narratives inform your data. And I will end that first part of the session by offering some insights on where do you start your research if you're new to reporting or journalism? And then I will shift gears to the second part of the presentation, which will look briefly at 2 different data sources using the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and specifically looking at injury and illness and employment data. And I do want to acknowledge before I jump into my presentation that as reporters and journalists, you have very challenging jobs, but also a very powerful role in how you responsibly report information to the public. And from my experience, reporters have been very instrumental at exposing and also building a public awareness of what's happening inside the warehousing industry. What are the conditions inside these facilities? So I really do want to note that I understand that you have a really important job as you're reporting or in your journalist careers. And some of the photos that you'll see up in the screen illustrate a campaign that I'm going to touch on in 2021 in collaboration with the Teamsters Union and the Los Angeles Federation of Labor. We ran a warehousing bill with the tagline, "Work shouldn't hurt." And reporters and the media were really key to the success of this campaign. And when we ran this campaign, there was like real issues that were impacting warehouse workers, and these issues range from health and safety, COVID-19 related issues, as well as really high injury rates in the workplace. And we knew that data was very important to putting out the picture of how high these injuries were, but we really centered on worker experiences and for this major policy campaign. And we had workers talk to reporters so they could understand the nuances of why warehouse workers were getting frequently injured in the workplace. What were the work policies and practices that were leading to these injuries in addition to retaliation in the workplace? And through this campaign, there were 2 reports that were produced, and you'll see here on the left-hand side, it's a report in collaboration with WWRC and the Human Impact Partner. They're a public health organization that does really great research and looked and produced the report that's on the screen, the public health crisis hidden in Amazon warehouses. And then to your right side, you'll see another report that was produced in collaboration with the Los Angeles Labor Federation and the Unemployed Workers United. And this one really highlighted warehouses in the LA County and the injury rates. And I do encourage everyone to really look at both of these reports, as I do think they have really good examples of how do narratives, worker experiences really inform your data. So I want to point everyone to these really great reports. And right now I'll be showing you all an example of how worker experiences informs data and captures a holistic picture of conditions inside warehouse facilities. And ultimately, my goal with this example is to demonstrate how worker experiences fill in the gaps of what we cannot see by looking at quantitative data. So we can see in this slide, you'll see it's very busy, but there is a bar chart on the left-hand side, and that reports injury and illness data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's looking at 2018 national warehouse industry averages, which at the time of this report, that was the latest data that we had on industry-related averages for injuries, and we compared it with the 2019 injury rate at Amazon warehouse facilities in California. And this data, as you can see on the image, they do show that many of these California facilities double or more than double had industry double or more than double in injuries compared to the industry average of injuries. And this data alone was very helpful for reporters to get a snapshot of what are the injury rates at Amazon facilities looking like, but also talking to workers really helped tease out why these injuries were happening. And when we had reporters sit down with workers to talk about, why are these injuries so high, we had reporters were able to understand that workers were getting injured very frequently in these facilities because the pace of work was too fast. Workers were pushing themselves to meet rate or performance standards that put them at a higher risk of ergonomic injuries, and also that put them at a higher risk of discipline if they did not meet the rate or performance standard. So through these conversations, reporters were also able to understand some of the practices that Amazon uses, such as time off task, also known as TOT for a lot of reporters. And this practice inside the facilities was also a big contributor to why injuries were so high. And something really important that I do want to note is that injury data is often very underreported by employers. So I do want to make that acknowledgement up front. And I know that if you are new to reporting or journalism, you might have questions on like, where do I start my research if I'm reporting on a specific industry? And I do want to offer some insights on how do you do that. And if you're new to researching or just informing, writing on an industry, it is very likely that there's already someone in an organization, worker center, a labor union or a group, or even a network like the National Kosh that already know people who've been doing research in the industry you're writing about. And these people have been doing it for many, many years. And it's really important to know, who to reach out to and rely on these people to help you collect industry information as well as trends, because these folks have been doing it for a very long time and can easily facilitate that information to you. Also, another very important thing is that these groups are also in contact with workers and who might be willing to talk to you and facilitate that process in your reporting in your reporting. And really important is building a relationship with these organizations. If you're someone who constantly reports on the same industry, it makes it so much easier in your work and how you gather your information if you already have a built-in relationship with an organization, worker center, or union who's already who you've already worked in the past. And we have had something very similar with some reporters that we've worked in previous occasions. Yeah. And another point that I do want to stress in this session is talking to the employer is not enough. It's very often that, and I've seen reports that only have the employer's perspective or the employer's commenting on an issue. And it's typically comments that are very one-sided and don't really capture the entire narrative of what's happening in the workplace. And this is very true. Workers are the experts in the workplace. They are the ones that are living the experience every day, and they know what's not going the right way and how to fix things. So it's really important to make sure that you are talking to the workers as you're reporting on your story related to any industry. And one example that I will give is when you talk to workers, workers are able to request or share information with you. And one example, and there's a lot of other examples, but one example I want to point to are the OSHA Log 300s. And the OSHA Log 300s are records maintained by the employer of recordable injuries and illnesses that occur on the job. And the full log contains the when and where an injury occurred, the nature of the case, the name and the job title of the employee injured, and the number of days away from work or on restricted or light duty. And employees, employee representatives, and even former employees have the right to obtain a copy of the logs. However, I do want to note that this takes time and it's a process, and organizations like us have in the past helped workers retrieve the records, but it does take time to gather this information. And I believe Eric will also be showing an image of what those logs look like, but I just wanted to give a description of them before. And the very last thing that I want to touch on in terms of insights and feedback is that I want to underline that when workers talk to any reporter or journalist publicly about issues in the workplace, they are putting themselves at risk of retaliation from their employer. And employer retaliation can take different forms in the workplace. And we've seen workers lose their jobs. We've seen workers who become targets from their supervisors. We've seen workers who are constantly surveilled in warehouse facilities because they talk publicly to a reporter. We've seen workers who are moved from regular tasks to heavier workloads that ultimately push workers out of work. And in some other more unusual cases, we've also seen employers terminate workers within a year or more of after talking to a reporter. So the range of retaliation varies, but workers really do put themselves as targets when they speak to reporters publicly. And what we always tell reporters to just lessen this risk is to allow workers to speak off the record or allow them to use pseudonyms or nicknames rather than using their actual names so they can protect their identity as much as they can. And if you're talking to workers, ensure to build in additional time in your reporting. Workers will most likely talk to you on their days off or on weekends. And I cannot stress enough about the importance of engaging with organizations that are already in contact with workers, because it to an extent, it fast tracks the risk of retaliation, because these organizations are already working with worker leaders and people who would be willing to talk to you and can share a lot of information. So I want to end that piece there and just really quickly highlight that from the campaign that I was mentioning earlier today, we did win Assembly Bill 701 in California that gave warehouse workers more transparency over the rate and productivity standards at their workplace and anti-retaliation protections, which was great. So now I will shift to the quantitative data, and I will do a very brief overview of injury, illness, and fatality data and employment data, and then we'll see Scott and Eric who will go a bit deeper on the injury data. So really quickly, for people who are not familiar with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's an agency of the United States Department of Labor that measures labor market activity, working conditions, the price changes by collecting, analyzing, and also eventually disseminating this economic information to the public. And this here that you see on the screen is a homepage of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's a pretty busy page, but I do want to pinpoint to a couple of easy ways to find information if you already know what you're looking for. So if you know that you're looking for unemployment data or employment data, we have the search engine that's on the top right-hand side, and you can easily use some keywords like unemployment data, so you can get and search and get a list of data, get a list of things you can start looking into if you're new to using BLS data. Another really great tool that I always reference and I use is the subject that you see up here on the menu bar. And I'll show you what the subject looks like. And it'll give you this sort of breakdown. And this breakdown gives you a list of the topical areas or subjects covered by the BLS data. And you'll see other really important tools on the menu bar, such as data and tools, publications, which are also very important if you're new to using BLS data. But I'm going to quickly go back to the other slide. Another thing that I want to note here is that the BLS produces monthly and annual reviews where you can access recently published data. So here you'll see on the screen some of the recent numbers of when the screenshot was taken, but also down here you'll find economic news releases, and you can break it down by your state as well as by subject. And this is really helpful to help you digest a lot of this data information if you're not used to analyzing this data very frequently. So before I jump into the actual data, I do want us to revisit what are NAICS and SIC codes, which are one of the first things you need to know before you start diving into industry data. And the Standard Industrial Classification System, also referred as SIC codes, that was the first system developed by the United States, which classified individual industries for the purpose of collecting, analyzing, and publishing statistical data on related to the economy. But in 1997, the US, Canada, and Mexico, they created the North American Industry Classification System, which now we refer to as NAICS codes. And it essentially replaced the SIC code system, but there's still a lot of websites, and you'll see it throughout the other presenters that still include SIC codes. So it's still used in other databases, but most frequently you'll see NAICS codes that are used. And NAICS codes are revised every 5 years, and the latest revision was in 2022, which we'll see an example right now. And then really quickly, just a quick run through. NAICS code is an industry classification system which groups the different establishments into industries based on similarities to each other. So here you'll see the website where you can find your NAICS code for your industry. And a really quick way to find it is to go to reference file, you click on 2022, which is the most updated, and then you'll get a list, which you'll see here on the screen here. But also if you don't know how to do that, you can do a quick search on the left-hand side. There's these little search engines, and you can drop in the industry you're looking into. So if it's warehousing, you drop in warehousing and you press go, and it'll take you directly to see the different NAICS codes. And the one thing that I will make a quick note, because you can see it here on the screen, is that for the NAICS code is usually a 2-digit number to begin with. You'll see that here, but there are some industries, and you can see on the screen, that have like the retail, manufacturing, and transportation and warehousing, that have more than one NAICS 2-digit number. And this is typically because these industries have some of the largest employment as well as share in the market. So it is common that you'll see these industries that have more than one NAICS 2-digit number. And then as you're looking more into these NAICS codes, eventually the final NAICS codes can go up to 6-digit numbers. Yes, So I just want to make sure that you're aware that the NAICS code will be adding more numbers, and that typically is broken down by subsector as you're looking at the different NAICS codes. Awesome. And just shifting gears to the injury data. So BLS does collect employer-reported data on fatal and non-fatal injuries and illnesses in the workplace. And the data is captured in 2 different surveys. And the first survey is the survey of occupational injuries and illnesses. And the second one, which I will briefly just show you, is the census of fatal occupational injuries. But just going back to the first survey, so the survey of occupational injuries and illnesses gets sent out to private and public sector businesses annually, and collects data on non-fatal injuries and illnesses. This type of data that is collected is workforce information, hours worked by the employees, days away from work due to injury or illness, days of job transfers or work restrictions, total number of injuries, and including respiratory conditions, demographic, and incident information. So this is sort of like a laundry list of the type of information that's collected by the survey. And really important to note is that this data for this first survey is broken down by NAICS code, but also what they called SOC codes. They're also known as the standard occupational classification codes, and which identify the primary duties of workers employed in the business. So very important distinction. NAICS codes primarily classify the activity of a business establishment. They do not describe the occupation held by people within a particular industry, within the particular industry you're looking into. So I really want to make that distinction. And then really quickly, the second survey, the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries survey, provides a comprehensive count of fatal workplace injuries. This data is issued annually on the year prior. So again, if you're not an expert on BLS data, I would always refer you to look at the latest numbers, look at the fatal and non-fatal injury and illness table. So in both slides for both surveys, you'll see here press releases, and a lot of these releases have a comprehensive, digestible way of understanding the data. So I would always refer you to that. And really quickly, shifting to employment data. So BLS does collect information on employment numbers, and these numbers are reported at various geographic levels, national, state, and local, local being very metropolitan area. And it also reports employment data by occupation and worker characteristics such as age, gender, education, and for the employment sector, it also reports on other things like employment projections, but it has been the case in my experience, that when we talk to reporters, they're mostly interested to know what are the employment numbers rather than employment projections. So what we do at WWRC, we tend to track wage and employment numbers using the Occupation Employment and Wage Statistics Survey, which is what you're seeing on the screen. And we'll look at one example, and here you'll see some of the tables. If you click on OEWS tables, you'll see a breakdown of national data, but also metropolitan state data. And this is one of the examples that I want to show everyone, and that I want to show everyone as an example. And these are the 3 different occupational codes that we reference to when we're looking at this data. And I do want to note, and very important when you're looking at this data, if you're reporting on median hourly wages, please report on median hourly wages, because we've had reporters who use mean numbers, and typically that's it. Typically, if you have a data set with extreme values, it skews your average. So we always encourage people to use the median hourly wage or use median annual salary, because it gives you a better description of what actually workers are making, and it doesn't skew it with some workers who might be earning more, and then it skews the entire data. So really encouraging everyone to always use the median hourly wage. And before I conclude my presentation, another resource that is not here, but for reporters in California, we do have the economic employment data, also known as EDD, which is a division within our state labor agency that administers and oversees, among many things, employment services programs and employment data. And each state has something similar to a state labor or workforce development agency, and they also collect state labor market information and employment data. So really encouraging folks in other states to find an agency that can also, you can find more local data, employment data. And with
Maria,
that
Maria, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and with that, that concludes my presentation, and thank you everyone. And here's the links and resources to what I was referencing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mireya, for explaining all of that, from worker retaliation to the significance of the NICS codes for the OSHA 300 logs. Okay, so like I said, we will now take questions. So I'm sure some of you might have questions for Mireya based on her presentation. So there are two ways which we'll be doing that. One is you can drop them in the chat and I'll read them out loud. But if you want to ask your question directly, which is great, please just raise your hand using the Zoom feature on the bottom of the menu panel, and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. Okay, there's a question in the chat that says, can you look at the breakdown of private sector versus public sector employees by occupation?
Quick clarifying question. Is this for injury, illnesses data, or are you referring more to employment data?
That question came from Peter. So Peter Eisler, if you'd like to unmute yourself and maybe provide some clarity, that would be helpful.
Hi, this is Pete. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So on that last chart that you were showing, where it showed, for a particular occupation, the number of employees, I'm wondering, can you look at that occupation and see a breakdown of the number of employees on how many are in public sector versus private sector?
That's a really good question, and I actually did not have enough time to go even deeper. But you can also look, and this is like a difference. You would be looking at NAICS codes, but there's also for warehousing, you have workers who are coming in through staffing agencies. So that's a different NAICS code that you would have to look at for those numbers. But going to your question versus public and private sector, I do believe that we can look at some of that data, but you probably have to look at some of the NAICS codes. And what I showed was only the SOC codes, which is by occupation. But we have used occupation and NAICS codes, especially when we're looking at staffing agencies, because we're also trying to report on workers who are not directly hired by the companies, but rather by temp agencies.
Great, thank you, Mireya. Okay, next question comes from Steve Tullikin. Can reporters request a company's OSHA 300 logs?
So you would need please, Eric, I think Eric and Scott have had more of these experiences, but usually it has to be a former employee or current employee to request them, or a representative of the employee. I have not encountered situations, and maybe Eric and Scott can expand on this in their presentation, but I have not encountered a situation where a reporter will get those log 300s alone without a worker. But maybe it is possible. I just have not seen it in my experience at WWRC. And hopefully we can pin that question for Scott and Eric. And I'm thinking more Eric, since he'll be showing some of the images of the log 300s, in case in his experience he's seen other reporters get the OSHA log 300s without a worker. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And the next question is, with the NICS codes updated every 5 years, does that hinder data analysis across more than 5 years, or are the codes pretty consistent over time?
So Some of the codes do change when there's updates, so I always reference people to look at the updated NAICS codes. But I do not have, I cannot speak any further whether it's, whether it really hinders a lot of your analysis. Besides, like, it's really important to look and see what NAICS codes were updated for your reporting, and also for accountability and how you're presenting the data. But maybe also Eric and Scott might have a little bit more to share on that end, if we want to bring that question back.
Okay, thanks. Another question. You mentioned that OSHA log 300s can be acquired by workers themselves and their advocates. Are these accessible to journalists as well via FOIA or otherwise?
So if you're working with an organization, just say WWRC, and we have in other cases supported workers to get their logs, and a lot of that support is supporting with an official letter that workers can submit so they can get their logs. So if you are working with an organization, it could be likely that they share the log information. But in terms of doing it through a FOIA request, I think that's more of an Eric question. But if you are working with an organization, it could be likely that they share those documents with you, but it does take time in terms of a process. Yeah.
Got it. And someone wanted to know, when you speak about employee representation, are you referring to unions theoretically?
Well, so yeah, so it could be a union representative, but also so like WWRC could also be quote unquote interpreted as like an employee representative. We're not a union, to be clear, but we have supported workers. And that's, we've been able to help workers get their records. But we're not a union, to be clear.
Great. Thank you, Mireya. Are there any other questions for Mireya?
And just the one other thing that I'll mention, I know we have other presenters who will also be presenting. I can also answer questions offline if we don't get to them. So just want to acknowledge that we're on a time crunch, and I can get back to you on questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, before we go on to our second speaker, just wanted to pause and do a quick poll question for everyone here. It's good intel for us to know. And also because with our next speaker, we're going to get pretty technical. All right, so can the poll question be posted, or do I have to do the poll?
Yeah, you can launch it.
Okay, I'll launch it. Okay, which data sources have you used for reporting in the past? So there's a few options. You can click on multiple options if they're applicable to you. Okay, it looks like a lot of you have used BLS before, followed by OSHA data, with state OSHA data coming in a strong third, along with local police and other public safety agencies. All right. And let me just share those results now. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for that intel. I will now move on to the next speaker, who is Scott Schneider. He is a National Cost Advisor and recently retired as Health and Safety Directors of the Laborers Union. Over his career, he helped develop standards to protect workers from asbestos and silica, fought to protect workers from noise exposure and ergonomic injuries, among many other accomplishments. Thank you so much, Scott, for joining us.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. Well, and thank you to Maria for giving the introduction and going into some of the some of the data we'll be discussing more in detail right now. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go over, talk a little more about the BLS data, the injury and illness data, the fatality data. Then I'm going to introduce some of the inspection and enforcement data from OSHA and talk a little bit about state programs, review some of the data that's available from NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, talk a little bit about the limitations of the data, talk about workers' comp data briefly, and some of the data available from the AFL-CIO and also from CPWR, which focuses on the construction industry. Okay, the BLS data, as Maria says, on workplace fatalities, injuries, and illnesses. They collect data, self-reported data from employers on injuries and illnesses from 200,000 employers each year. And it can be useful to show trends from year to year, geographic hotspots, and then which occupations or industries may be most at risk for various kinds of injuries. It reports both the numbers and the rates of recordable injuries for cases involving days away from work, which are generally the more serious cases. And the data is usually reported in November or December of the year, and it's data that was collected the previous year. So the fall of 2022, they reported 2021 data. The illness data that's reported are the least reliable and the most underreported, although there is underreporting of the injury data as well. And it's very clear from a number of studies that there is quite a bit of underreporting. But it's helpful sometimes. I mean, the underreporting is consistent from year to year, so you can look at trends, whether the injuries are increasing or decreasing in a particular sector. The fatality data, though, are reported from multiple sources. The Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries, they look at not only reports from OSHA inspections, from employers, but also things like hospital records to try to get an accurate count. And it's much more accurate than the injury and the illness data. And it's best to use the rate data for comparisons instead of counts, because then you have the number of injuries per 100 full-time workers. As Maria mentioned, the lost time injury data that's reported from the Bureau of Labor Statistics is reported by part of the body, like back injuries, eye injuries, leg injuries, etc. It's by the nature of the industry. Are they burns or sprains and strains or fractures or amputations? They report the source of the injury, like a ladder, and ladders, apparent, or according to the data, are the most dangerous. It's the most dangerous piece of equipment in the construction industry. There's about 100 ladder fatalities a year in construction. By the numbers of days away from work that are because of the injury, the age of the worker, and probably most importantly, the event or exposure, which means was it from a fall? Was it a struck by injury? Was it a transportation incident, which is a large percentage of the injuries? 2/3 of all the injuries involve no lost work time, but then many of them do. And the injury data is often used by OSHA to target high-risk employers and high-risk industries. As Maria mentioned, here is the OSHA log 300. And you can see it has the employee's name, their job title, the date of the injury or illness, where the event occurred, like at the loading dock, that describes the injury that occurred, and tells you whether there were days away from work or a fatality, or if there wasn't a day away from work, whether they were transferred to a different job, or restricted in their activities, or it was another recordable case. It tells the number of days away from work or job transfer. And then on the right side, you can see, in addition to injuries, they have to classify and log skin disorders, respiratory disorders, hearing loss cases, etc. So it's a lot of information that employers have to record every year. And then in February of each year, they're required to post a summary of this log. It's called the Form 300A They have to post it in the workplace so that everybody has access to it. And workers can request copies of the entire log if they so desire. This is an example of some of the data that's presented on the BLS Injury and Illness and Fatality website.
It's not.
You see here, there's a chart showing the injury and illness data, the recordable cases data from 2017 to 2021. It doesn't show much change, but that's for all injuries and illnesses. And if you look at subpopulations like Hispanic workers, you can see there have been increases in injuries. So you have to dig down into the more deeply into the detailed data. And although fatalities went down in 2021, they went up significantly in 2021. So you have to keep track of that. And you can see on the bottom that it says there were 2,600 or 2.6 million recordable cases in 2021 and 4,764 total fatalities in all sectors. And the census, well, I'll get to the census data in a second. Here, I wanted to show you the difference between looking at the number of injuries and the rate of injuries. And you can see from these graphs on the left, you can see the largest number of injuries was in the healthcare sector and social assistance, and then followed by manufacturing and retail. But if you look at the rate of the injuries on the right side of the chart, the right chart, you can see that agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting has the highest rate of fatalities, or of injuries and illnesses, and transportation and warehousing is also very, very high. And then healthcare and social assistance is a little bit lower. So so even though there weren't many people who work in agriculture anymore, or forestry and fishing, but the number of injuries is very high. So so they have a high rate. The census of fatal occupational injuries, you can see the types of charts and graphs that are available, the number of injuries by employee status. Some of them are temp workers, or by race, or by age group. Fatal workplace injuries for Hispanic or Latino workers, or by event. And at the bottom, they also have charts on the number of injuries available by state. And they also publish a lot of articles based on the CFOI data, and I'll get back to that in a second. So, yeah, here's an example of some of the analyses they publish. They publish a monthly report called the Monthly Labor Report, which has articles on all their data for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this is one article that came out in 2013 that I was particularly interested in, because the labor's union where I worked for almost 20 years represents a lot of road construction workers. So they did analysis of the 962 fatalities at road construction sites from 2003 to 2010, and found that nearly half of them resulted from a worker being run over or backed over by a vehicle or mobile equipment on the site. So there's a lot of interesting data and a lot of interesting conclusions you can draw from it. And they do a very good job of doing data analysis. And I found that the analysts at the BLS are always very helpful in doing analyses of subsectors for me, if you call them. So the OSHA data, I'm going to talk a little bit about the OSHA data. It's mostly their enforcement data about their inspections. And Eric's going to go into a lot more detail on how to dig down into greater detail on this. But you can look for citations of a particular company, particular industry, a particular standard. If you look at the most frequently cited standards, they do fatality investigations, and you can access those reports. They separate out inspections with high penalties, and also reports of severe injuries, which is something that's relatively new. Since the Obama administration, people have to report automatically to OSHA if they have a severe injury like this, an amputation or loss of an eye, for example. And now there's new establishment specific data that's on their website, and Eric will talk a little bit more about that. This is the OSHA data website. You can see all the different categories of data that's available, including On the right side, they have chemical exposure data for health hazards. They have data on COVID. And Eric's going to go into great detail on the injury tracking application, which is the most current data. And they also, you can see, as Maria was talking about, you can do a search for SIC codes, the SIC manual, NAICS codes, most frequently cited OSHA standards. And you can also do an industry profile, take one industry and look at violations of a particular OSHA standard for that industry. This is another website run by the Department of Labor of all their enforcement data, and it includes not only OSHA data, OSHA enforcement data, but mine safety and health data, and data on wage and hour violations. And you can look at it nationally or by state. And Eric's going to show you how this data site works, but the OSHA data can be accessed, their enforcement data, from their website or from the Department of Labor website. The OSHA website will show you what an inspected company was cited for, any violations of OSHA standards, the penalties that were assessed, and what was paid after any settlements. You can file an FOIA request for the more detailed inspection reports, which includes notes from the inspectors, interviews with workers, and what they call the inspection narrative, what happened. And you have to take that in with a grain of salt, because many hazards don't have OSHA standards. So even if they didn't find an OSHA violation, there still may be hazards present. For example, there's no OSHA standards on a federal level for heat stress or for workplace violence. They can be cited under what's called the general duty clause, which is the general requirement that companies have to provide a safe workplace, but it's much more difficult to do that. Some of the standards are very outdated, like the chemical hazard permissible exposure limits that were set. They're using the ones that were set in 1969, so over almost 65 years ago, and they haven't been updated. So even if there's not a violation, there still may be a hazard. And some of the standards, like the lead standard, we know that much more now about the dangers of low levels of lead exposure than they did the lead standard about 30 years ago. So even if there's no violations, there still can be a hazard present. And plus, OSHA only does about 24,000 inspections a year out of millions of workplaces. So most workplaces never get inspected. And about half of them are what they call programmed inspections, which are randomly chosen based on criteria like the size of the firm, and also they focus those on high hazard industries, and that some of them are also the others are complaint inspections or fatality investigations, and there's also several, not that many, but repeat inspections where they've cited somebody and they go back to check to see if the violations were corrected. The citations that OSHA issues are usually for serious hazards, those that are likely to cause injury or death. There are other citations for other than serious hazards that are not likely to cause injury or death. And then they have willful violations for if they can prove that the company knowingly violated the standards, and repeat citations if they've been previously cited for the same hazard. The penalties are much higher for willful and repeat violations. Penalties are often reduced during closing conferences if companies claim they're going to make a good faith effort to correct the problems. And the companies can also contest the citations. They can contest the penalties, whether they got the citation, whether they should have gotten the citation or not, what the penalties were, and the amount of time that's given to them to abate the hazards. And those contests go through what's called the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. And OSHA has some special emphasis programs for certain hazards. If they're finding that, for example, the number of trench violations or trench fatalities has increased in recent years, they'll put out a special emphasis program where they'll ask their area offices to do additional inspections specifically on that hazard. OSHA recently announced a new policy. They revived a policy to allow area offices in certain cases to issue instance by instance citations, where if you have a hazard like machine guarding hazard, and there are 10 machines that are not guarded, they could issue now 10 citations and 10 penalties, whereas in the past they used to group them in many cases and only issue one citation. About half of the states have their own state OSHA program, and those programs are supposed to be at least as effective as the federal program. In recent years, if you're in a state program, then the state is required to cover all public employees in that state by their program. Public employees in a non-state OSHA program are not covered. But there are a few states that recently have instituted state OSHA programs that only cover public employees, and I'll show you a map of those in a minute from the OSHA website. The enforcement data from the states should be accessible from the federal OSHA website, but also available in many cases through the state OSHA websites. So the public employees are only covered by OSHA in those states that have their own state OSHA programs. And there are some differences in penalties on enforcement in the states. Some states are lagging in terms of catching up with where the federal enforcement penalties are. Now, OSHA does do an annual review of state plan performance. They call these the FAME reports, and those are available from the OSHA website as well. And you can look and see what about the flaws and the inadequacies of many of these state programs. There are a couple of state programs that are in some ways better than the feds in terms of putting out about new OSHA standards, but in general, most of the state programs lag behind. This map from the OSHA website, in the medium blue, you can see the state OSHA plans that have full state OSHA plans. And the dark blue are those that only cover public employees. I want to talk for a minute about the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. They were tasked back in 1970 with doing research, when they were created, with doing research on occupational safety and health, and they have a lot of useful information in databases. In particular, they do a lot of surveillance, trying to look at the prevalence of various occupational diseases and injuries. Like they have a surveillance system for work-related lung diseases, for blood lead surveillance, for pesticide injuries and illnesses, for hearing loss. And they also do deep dives into some sectors like that are of particular interest, like the oil and gas drilling sector, commercial fishing, firefighting, long-haul truck drivers, mining. And they also have a program to do detailed investigations of fatalities, a select number, some of which are done by the state health departments under contract with NIOSH. And these case reports show not only they don't have the company names on them, but they can show you how the fatality occurred and some of the solutions, what could have been done to prevent it, and lessons learned. And some of them, they also have short animated videos to go with them. And you can search the case reports. I'll show you, well, here's an example. Here's a case report of a motor vehicle fatality. A law enforcement officer was killed on a 3-lane interstate highway by an individual who was driving under the influence of prescription drugs. And also, this is a report that they did of fatalities in the lawn care industry, which is one of the most hazardous occupations in the service sector. So they looked at 206 landscaping workers who had died on the job. And here it shows you some of the categories you can look at. They sort some of the fatalities by the cause of the fatality, like whether it's a fall from a ladder in construction, a machine guarding fatality, a motor vehicle fatality, trenching, electrocutions, and also by industry. Like they have special category of fatalities among youth in agriculture or in commercial fishing. So there's a lot of useful information. They also do quite a bit of research looking at what's hurting and killing workers in the US. They publish a lot of it in peer-reviewed publications that are available through their internal database called NIOSH 2. And we have links to all these that we're sending you. And they also, you can look at their publications, like they put out some very useful publications, like this one that I helped them with on simple solutions on ergonomics for construction workers. And I found NIOSH researchers are excellent sources of information for hazards and solutions. Often if you find a report that was done, you can look at the authors and call NIOSH and get in touch with the author. And they're often very helpful looking at that particular problem. Okay.
Scott, timekeeping here, if you can just wrap up in the next couple minutes.
Yeah,
Thanks.
almost done, thanks. Workers' comp data is a state-by-state system. In general, there's very little that's available publicly for national data, but some states there's only 2 states that have their own state-run or workers' comp system, Washington State and Ohio, and they use the data for research purposes and publish a lot of interesting reports on the fatalities and injuries in their state. And some large insurance companies like Liberty Mutual show the most common injuries and most costly ones. I have 3 more slides. This data, I want to mention this data report that the AFL-CIO has been doing for over 30 years. It's be available next month for last year's data. It's called Death on the Job. It has probably 150 to 200 pages of charts and graphs and tables summarizing where we are, where we've come from, and the challenges ahead. It has separate tables on Hispanic and Latino workers, on racial disparities, and state-by-state analyses on enforcement. And then lastly, I wanted to mention CPWR, the Center for Construction Research and Training that I worked at for several years. They publish a chart book with detailed analyses of injuries and illnesses and fatalities in the construction industry, as well as other industry-specific data on employment and wages. And they publish quarterly reports on individual hazards like struck by hazards. This is one of the more recent reports, came out in January, on the leading causes of all deaths among current, retired, and former construction workers. And they have a new report that came out yesterday on the 4 main causes of fatalities in construction. So I'm done. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to more discussions and questions.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for getting into a lot of those different data sources that generated a lot of questions during your presentation. So let me read some off in the order that they came in. Mike asks, is OSHA still collecting severe injury data?
Yes.
Okay, moving on to the next one. Katarina wants to know, does anyone happen to know if there's a document in Mexico corresponding or similar to OSHA's Form 300? Jesse did put a link in the chat, but just wanted to pitch that out there in case you wanted to add to that.
I'm not aware of it. I don't know much about the Mexican system.
Okay. Well, next question. Are OSHA 300 logs or 300A summaries for public sector workplaces a public record? Should I be able to get those through a records request?
I believe the answer is yes, you can. And maybe Eric can add to that answer later.
Okay. Last question that I saw was actually for Peter Dooley. Peter, I don't know if you're still on, but it was from Mike saying, is the data still compiled and released or available through FOIA? I wrote up the first severe injury report, but a lot of information became less available during PVS administration.
Yeah, yes, it is available, and there was a link put on the chat so people can get right to the OSHA site for that information.
Great. Okay. Any other questions for Scott? If you would like to unmute yourself and have some direct interaction, that would be great too.
Hi, everyone. I have a question. Hi, Scott. It's good to see you again. I'm curious, as journalists, and I'm not sure if you can answer this actually, but I'm curious, how do we sort of account for the underreporting or the cases that we're not hearing about? Is there anything that we can do to sort of bridge that gap, or is there just like nothing we can do? Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's been a number of research studies looking at underreporting of OSHA injury data, and what they found was that basically some of the data, I mean, it's much harder to underreport severe injuries, like, you know, somebody breaks a leg, you know, that's generally gets reported, but the underreporting tends to be more on the illness side and also the chronic injuries like back injuries. So I don't know how we get a better estimate of how what the true picture is. There have been some research studies done about, gosh, 40 years ago. NIOSH did a study in Washington State where they actually looked at illnesses in the workplace. They did studies where they interviewed all the employees to find out how many illnesses there were and injuries, and they compared that with the injury logs, and they found that, and they documented the underreporting. But I think other than interviewing workers and finding out about unreported injuries, it's very difficult to get a true estimate of what the real picture is. Thanks for your question, Yana.
Thanks, Scott.
You're muted.
Okay, a few more questions came into the chat. Hannah asks, since so much of this data is presented in aggregate, do you have any examples of how local reporters extracted stories from the trends captured in it?
Yeah, I mean, there are cases where local reporters have gone and done, you know, FOIA requests for a lot of data, company data. There was a great story in the Indianapolis Star several years ago about a company that was making chemicals, and there was a lot of underreporting of illnesses, but I can't remember exactly the story right now. But yeah, there have been some good instances where reporters have done digging on a local level.
Okay. There's two questions from Mike. Is there a correlation between injuries and fatalities?
I don't know what the correlation is, but I mean, the fact is there with 2 million some injuries and only 5,000 fatalities a year, fatalities are relatively rare. So fatalities, you know, I don't know that there's a correlation, but I would expect that those workplaces that have a lot of injuries are probably more likely to have a fatality, but I don't know of any studies that have looked at the correlation.
All right, well, I can say and if the industry is big enough, I have, at least in one case, you know, looked at the fact that the industry has very few injuries, but a lot of fatalities, under the assumption it's a lot harder to avoid reporting a fatality, and use that sometimes to show that there's underreporting.
Right, absolutely. And in fact, you know, we look at these. There have been some great reports out on what they call the VPP program, where companies are given an award for having a great safety program. They're recognized for that, and then fatalities occur on those VPP sites. So it's, you know, you're right. It can happen on many sites.
And I'm also thinking that it's a way to show that an industry is dangerous even when they're not reporting properly.
Correct.
Tatiana asks, do you have any digital tools you like to use to analyze these records, either converting them from PDF to Excel or tools for analyzing large data sets?
Yeah, that's a question for Eric. He's going to answer that in the next presentation. So thanks for the question.
Okay, and let's see here. There's a comment from Peg. I'm not sure if it's a question, but I'll read it out loud. The AFL-CIO report has both national and state data. However, not all states participate in the BLS survey, so there isn't injury data for all states. There is fatality data for every state.
Yeah, that's big.
Okay, so let's move on to our last presenter.
Melissa, can I just break in for a second?
Sure.
This is Roger with National Kosh. Tim Roden, who started a auto transcript. I kind of ask you to pause that, if you will. We're here on background, not for attribution basis, and having a transcript out there can be a bit of a problem for some of our presenters. So if we get that pause before we go ahead, that'd be very helpful. Thank you. Back to you, Melissa.
All right, thanks, Roger. All right, now introducing Eric Fruman. He is the Safety and Health Director for the Strategic Organizing Center, a democratic coalition of national labor unions representing more than 2 million workers. He is a leading national trade union spokesperson and strategist on issues of job safety, health, and disability, including OSHA standard setting and enforcement. He's testified frequently before congressional committees on workplace safety and health. Eric, thanks for being here.
Hi, good to be here, and we really appreciate everybody joining us today. So we are off the record here. There is a recording that we're going to have for teaching purposes, but not for distribution. And so a transcript, in at least speaking personally for me, is basically the same as a recording. And I would appreciate it if the person running the transcript would stop it. Okay, so you could start the slides then, Jesse. So my name is Eric Fruman. I'm the Health and Safety Director for the Strategic Organizing Center, which is a coalition of national labor unions representing about 3 million workers. I'm going to focus on sort of quantitative data on injuries, illnesses on the one hand, and enforcement on the other. I'll be going back and forth between the different kinds of data, but so just I'll try to be clear about which one I'm talking about at a particular moment. The enforcement data comes from the agency that does the enforcement. And for most industries, most workers, that's OSHA. There are other agencies that do worker safety enforcement. Mine Safety and Health Agency obviously is one of them. There are others. The injury data I'm going to talk about comes from the employers themselves. And you'll see how in a little bit. We're going to tell you about what you can find there, where you can find it, but also what's not there. Scott mentioned getting doing FOIA requests for copies of OSHA investigation files, inspectors' notes, photographs, and so forth. We don't have the opportunity in this session to go into that. Next slide. So OSHA's been in business since April 28th, 1971, and has been compiling a computerized data set for its enforcement data since that time. And the available records I'm talking about go back to that time. Clearly, the structure of the data set has changed over time, but it literally is that big. It's digital, it's searchable, and it has some of the key information that Scott already mentioned, details of the standards, the kinds of violations, the penalties, and even the detail of the number of workers who were exposed to a particular violation, or what the gravity of the hazard was. How likely would that hazard cause an injury, and if so, how bad would the injury be? It also allows you to get some sense of the terrible delays that afflict the appeals process when companies can stall their compliance with a mandate to fix the violation. Next slide. There are some problems you should be aware of. Someone asked about the NAICS code changing over time. Yes, you'll see, depending on the industry, the NAICS code involves sometimes the system didn't update properly, and you'll be missing a bunch of cases, a bunch of inspections. Also, depending on which of these portals you use, you may have to spell the company name precisely. Johnny's, whatever, General Motors, comma, Incorporated, period, not General Motors Incorporated, period. If the comma is not there, the search won't work. So I'll show you where that is, but you have to be alert to that. Someone asked about the tools for doing analysis. Excel works pretty good. So having Excel skills is going to be really important for looking at these data. In general, pretty simple Excel skills will cut it, but you may have to ask a colleague or a friend to help you out with linking all the different types of tables and data sets together. There are some really important filters, we'll call it, for doing these searches. It's always important to keep two different filters in mind. First, are you asking for all the inspections together, or just the ones by federal OSHA, or just by a state agency? Because there are vastly different practices and outcomes depending upon which version you get, and you may not want to mix them up. Likewise, you may want to be asking for all inspections, or inspections just those with violations, and getting them separately often is a good way to start. Finally, and I'll mention this again later, depending on the portal you use, you may be limited with the number of inspections that you could, for which you can get the data set at any particular time, to about 2,000. Next slide. Scott showed you a picture, an image of OSHA's data and statistics page. Is very important sort of a home base for going into the different data portals. It used to look like the one that Scott just showed you, and now they just changed it like this week, wouldn't you know, to a slightly different version. This is what it looks like now. But if you go on OSHA's website, search for data and statistics, you'll get something that looked like this, and I'll show you in a minute how to find the specific search portals that you want to use. Next slide. So one of those 6 different boxes there was called other data. Doesn't tell you that much, but if you open it up, what you will get is that website called the Department of Labor Enforcement data page. Scott showed you a picture of it, has sort of a map of the US, and that's a really important source for digital data. So next slide. It gives you 3 different ways of searching the data. The one on the left is a beta. I wouldn't use it. It's not that user-friendly. The 2 on the right are really good for different things. The one on the bottom, which I'll show you later, is a sort of a quick way, but not dirty, of getting some totals without having to download a whole data set and calculate the totals yourself. They do some of that for you. So the one on the top right here, the search form it's called, is the one that I often use and encourage people to use. Next slide. So here's an example of how I took that form and started doing a search. And so the theme today is warehouses. So I picked the blue boxes on the bottom give you some of your variables. OSHA office, federal or state, NAICS code. So we've got the NAICS code for warehousing. The year, you can pick whole years over a different period of time. And then if you click on violations, you get to pick those inspections that have violations versus those that don't. I also, in this case, picked the state, California, rather than the whole country. And the year 2021 to 22, and click search, and here's what we got. Next slide, sorry. So we ended up with 149 separate inspections over that 2-year period by the California State OSHA program in that NAICS code. And if you just click on the Excel icon, next slide, you get a table. And it's a wonderful Excel table, lets you do all the things you like doing in Excel, like filtering and searching and counting and averaging and so forth. There are 5 separate tables in this file. So on the bottom left, you see circled the words OSHA inspections. So this gives you the information for these 189 inspections. I think we showed 28 of them here. For the inspection overall, the name of the company, the location, the zip code, so you can figure out which employer you're dealing with here. And this is the left side of the table. And the first column is what's called the activity number. And that's the unique identifier that you'll need to use when you're trying to link the data in the other tables to this one. So it's also known as the inspection number. The formatting of inspection numbers has changed, a little complicated to go into now, but it is for these tables within this file, this data set, That's the critical unique identifier. So we have half the file shown here. Next slide. These are the other fields. So before we saw the name, address, and so forth. Now we see some more information about the inspection, including the type of inspection. Was it a planned accident driven by a complaint? When did they open it up? How many people worked there? When did they finish the on-site investigation with the closing conference? So you can put some time limits on it. Next slide. So this is the other table, the major table that is in this data set. So on the bottom, I circled violations. So the first table shows you the sort of overview of the inspection. Now we dig down into what the detailed violations were. What's the first column? It's the activity number. So if you want to know which of these individual violations, each row is a separate violation OSHA found in an inspection, which one of them applied to that company in the list, you have to link them by the activity number. So some of you may know how to do that in Excel. Sometimes you don't, you're just looking up one, you just do a search, but that's the critical way of joining it. What do we see here in this table? Well, in the activity number, in the first column, we see that there are multiple activity numbers because there were more than one site violation in that inspection. And if you see in the middle, I've grayed out line 27. So this is the left half of the table. We're going to go look at the right half in a minute, but keep in mind that there were 3 separate violations in that company, all with that inspection number that ends in 950. And one of them involved a few important things. Well, we look at the heading called standard. That's the code number for the standard that Cal OSHA found was violated. The classification of the violations, Scott mentioned serious violations are the more important ones. And most of these are not serious. Most of these are listed as other, do not involve mandatory penalties. They involve a judgment by the inspector that there was not a risk of serious injury to a worker. And then it gives the date that it was issued. Next slide. So this is the right half of the table, and it gives us some additional information about each of those violations. And you can see for that serious violation that in the gray row, the penalty was $18,000. California has a somewhat higher maximum than federal OSHA. Max in federal OSHA right now is about 15 grand. Remember, most of these violations were called other, and you can see what the penalties are in California for other violations, less than $1,000. So it makes a big difference whether the inspectors properly understand the nature of that hazard and properly classified it. The violation was issued August of 2021. And the next column says whether, the violation was appealed, contested in August of 2021. And once it's on appeal, in most states, the company doesn't have to fix it. So it makes a big difference how long it stays on appeal. And it's on appeal. Once it's contested, it's on appeal until there's what's called a final order date, which is either the company didn't appeal it or it was resolved through the legal process of settlement, the judge upholding it and so forth. So this violation was appealed in August of 2021 within a few weeks of the issuance, and it was finally resolved 6 months later. And during that time, the company had no obligation to appeal. What else does this tell us? It tells us there was one instance of that violation. So maybe it was, I forget what that standard involves. I apologize. But there was only one time that it occurred, however, and there was only one worker who was involved. The violation above that, there was only one of those that occurred, but there were 16 workers who were involved. Then the last column is pretty important. It says, what's the gravity of the violation? What's the chance that it will occur, that an injury will occur because of that hazard? A greater probability or less? And finally, if it does occur, how serious will it be? 10 is the worst, and 1 is the least serious, least likely to happen. And so it's not surprising that we see an $18,000 penalty, near the highest for a violation where a high probability that an injury will occur and that it will be very serious. What is stunning is that the violation above involving 16 workers, also classified as a number 10, was called an other violation with a $600 penalty. So this allows you to have a critique of how California inspectors evaluate the hazards they come across when they issue violations. Next slide. This is the other kind of search on that DOL enforcement data page, the visualization. And as you can see, the OSHA data are the bulk of the data in the DOL that are available on this website, but there's data from other enforcement agencies as well. Next slide. So I decided to do a search. I looked at the year, 2022. I looked at the same NAICS code. I looked at serious violations, and I looked at all of them in California, excuse me, all of them nationally, including both federal and state OSHA. And on the right, you can see the totals. You don't have to open up a table. 211 inspections in the warehouse industry in that year, 518 serious violations, or roughly 2.5 serious violations per inspection. And the majority of these were federal inspections because federal government covers more warehouses than the states, or does more inspections there. Next slide. Then I did it for California. And what we see here is, of course, most of them are now done by the state agency because federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over the private sector. 21 inspections, only 29 serious violations, about half the rate of serious violations. So again, the penalties are important in if it's a serious violation, but not so important otherwise. So if you were to click on the icon there, the Excel icon, what you would find is the exact same data table that I showed you from the other search form, but it all goes to the same source, but this gives you some of the interim results. If you're on deadline, you just want to verify a number, fact check, make sure that your totals were right. This is a pretty good way of doing it. Again, the caution, NAICS codes can be a little tricky. If you try to use this to do a name search, you're going to have to get the punctuation spelling exactly perfect. That's a pain in the butt, and I'm going to show you a way around that. Next slide. So on OSHA's back at the data and statistics page, you see something called the establishment search. And this was a search I did for using the name Amazon, basically the same period in California. Next slide. And this shows you, next slide. This shows you a listing just of a little bit of information about each inspection. It gives different names for the company, so it's a fuzzy data search, which is a big help. And normally it normally only shows you 20 results per page, which can be a pain. Like we could have come up with 150 or 300. So that's a problem. And on the next slide, I'm going to tell you quickly how to get around it. But also here, I'm going to, on the bottom, I'll show you a link to a circle around one of the inspection numbers. And we're going to open up in a minute. Let's see what that additional data below this page shows you. Anyway, next slide. So, like I said, we started off with only 20. How do we get to 32? Thank you to Mike Rebell from ProPublica years ago. You have to go to the URL, go to page 2, go back to page 1, go up to the URL, and you'll see in that red box, it says show 20. Okay, you can change it to show 50, and then you get all your 32, or change it to 500, you get all 350. Next slide. So if you click on that link for that one particular inspection, you'll see it starts showing more details. What kind of details? The same detail that's in the Excel spreadsheet. And in the bottom left corner, if you click on a link for the citation number, next slide, it can tell you what? The number of instances, the gravity, the number of workers exposed. So it's basically the same data set, but depending on what kind of a hurry you're in, whether you're good with Excel or not, this can be valuable as well. Fuzzy name search is a real strength for this particular search. Next slide. Okay, let's look at the injury data. So starting in 2016, OSHA started mandating employers to report the summary results of their OSHA logs. And those have been public since CIR won their FOIA case in August of 2020. Prior to that, for decades, they collected the data and they made some of it available. It was not as comprehensive a list. Next slide. So here's what the injury track, oh, excuse me. What's the underlying data for it? There's the list of injuries called the OSHA 300 form that employers keep. And this is the injury list, the log 300 from an Amazon warehouse in Washington State. And this is the last page, the bottom of the last page, and it shows you the totals for each category of injury. I don't have time to explain them all, but there were 189 injuries in this injuries and illnesses for this 1 year, 2019. And those show up in the bottom of this. Next slide. And this is the annual summary that the company also has to prepare, and which they, since 2016, they've had to submit to OSHA. So it's the same basic data that comes off the list of injuries that the employers have been keeping in the workplace for decades. Next slide. Oh, so go ahead, next slide. But with a big difference is that this form and what's on the OSHA website that you can download is the number of hours that are worked there, that people work there. And that's what allows you to calculate a rate, an injury rate, not just numbers. So comparing different workplaces, you have to use rates. Numbers can be valuable as well. So it's the employment numbers. They left off the actual total employment in this year's, in the form they had this year, but the work hours are there, and that's even more important than the total numbers. Next slide. So this is the injury tracking application web page for OSHA, and you can download you can click the link for the entire data set. It's not, you can't search within it. You have to download the entire data set. It's about 100 megabytes. And then you get to do your Excel analysis. Next slide. And so this is an example of what the data were for warehouses in California, all the ones who reported their injury data. So the company identifier is on the left. On the right is a lot of the details about the different kinds of injuries. And you'd have to go look at that. But the next slide, in the middle are the key fields. Next slide. The key fields that we pay attention to for the reporting for the data. And the first column, the very first yellow column, D, is the employer tax ID number, which could be valuable for avoiding naming problems. Column K is the number of employees in the establishment that the company reported. Column L is the total work hours. And then I inserted a couple of fields for some calculations. There are problems with these data, folks. Companies make mistakes submitting them, things of that nature. I'm almost done here, Roger. You have to look, use common sense. Like, this is ranked by injury rate. So the first line shows an injury rate of 878 injuries per 100 workers. Well, that's crazy. There's a typo somewhere. It's not till you get down to about the 10th row where you have a larger workplace with probably the correct employment number, probably the correct work hours, probably the correct number of injuries. And then you see a reasonably high injury rate. I think it's 39 or something. I mean, it's off the charts. It's very high, but it's not in the hundreds per 100 workers. And Amazon is down there near the bottom. Next slide. So these data from the injury tracking application have been opened up a tremendous window on a variety of industries, including warehouses. The Washington Post published its analysis in June of 2021. The company immediately responded, claimed that they were on the case, and they interestingly found the same kind of results we found. Next slide. Today's Guardian, I think Mike Sinato is still on the call here today. Paragraph 2, high injury rates at Amazon. Next slide. This is the analysis that we published last year. that has been picked up in quite a few stories, showing how Amazon's overall injury rates using the data that the company itself reported to OSHA are about double what they are for all the other warehouses who reported to OSHA. And finally, here's how, next slide, here's how the company, here's how we brought this information to the Securities and Exchange Commission when the company tried to claim that its rates were not higher than those of its competitors. Finally, OSHA uses these data themselves. The very last slide, please. This is an example of a citation they just issued last week to a warehouse in Colorado where they describe the high injury risks to the workers there. So it's a lot to cover. The slides will make it a little easier for you, and needless to say, you know, offline we could talk about the injury data tech, you know, the analysis techniques in greater detail. I want to just credit the folks on the call, Lord Rosenblatt from the Seattle Times, Mike Sonato, the people from from ProPublica, the Washington Post, and many others who've run with these data, made good use of them. It's been tremendously important for shining a light on what's really going on in the safety crisis at Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, so much for your presentation and for getting into the weeds of how to search for that data. We have one question in the chat from Farida, which I will read off, and then just a reminder to folks to please either write more questions in the chat or raise your hand so I can call on you and you can unmute yourselves. Okay, hers is a two-part question for you, Eric. Do we know what state plans like Cal OSHA report all their inspections and citations to federal OSHA? And are they in this database? And how do we know how long the lag is for a state inspection to show up in this database? Is it several days or months?
So the enforcement data that I showed you are all administered by federal OSHA. The states don't have an option about whether to report it to federal OSHA or not. It's part of the mandate that they have to comply with. OSHA pays half their costs, roughly. It's an integrated database. Some states do a better job than others in in filling out the forms on their computers. So you always have to be a little skeptical when you see something that looks weird, like why would they classify that violation as other when it had a gravity 10? Like, well, maybe they were just being sloppy, or they made a typo. They meant to hit 1 and they hit 10. But yes, all of the state inspections, on-site formal inspections, enforcement inspections are supposed to be logged into this one system and accessible through federal OSHA. I'm not aware of any state which independently administers an enforcement data set that you can search in the way that federal OSHA has, and can't imagine a reason why they'd want to do that. Now the question is, what's the lag for showing up? Both the feds and state agencies have a, I don't know, multi-week lag, probably maybe a month at the outside. After they certainly after they issue a citation, before the data will show up in there. Sometimes the fact that the inspection is happening will show up even before their investigation is over. But there's not a hard and fast rule about when the fact of the inspection, the existence of the inspection, will show up. I would say, generally speaking, a month after the inspection starts, and that could be 2 weeks after they already issued the citation. It could be 4 months before they issue the citation. But generally speaking, about a month after the inspection starts, it shows up.
Okay. Anybody else with a question for Eric?
Well,
okay. If there are no other questions, I would just like to pass it off to my colleague, Jessica Martinez, who is the co-executive director at National COSH. Jessica?
Thank you so much, Melissa, and many thanks to everyone here joining us today. Special thanks to all our presenters, Mireya, Scott, and Eric, for taking the time to share so much great information with all of us today. For the journalists who have joined us, we're thankful for your interest and participation in this session with a goal to support your in-depth quality reporting about workplace safety. As mentioned earlier, we're a longstanding network of Kosh groups with unique insight and direct experience with worker health and safety issues. In the past several years, we've seen a renewed interest among many journalists like yourselves in getting behind the scenes and reporting on the very real dangers workers face every day as they deliver essential goods and services. Many of these workers were identified as essential workers during the pandemic and critical to the well-being and economic foundation of this country, and workers who have been essential pre-pandemic and continue to be. So we're very glad to have so many of you with us today. We hope that it's a sign that we'll see much more high quality reporting about workplace health and safety. And as we wrap up, I'd like to take just a few minutes to share some ideas about how to approach these sensitive issues, which are literally a matter of life and death for workers and families. First, it's important to know that language matters, and injuries and illnesses and fatalities at work are preventable, okay? And they are in big, bold cap letters, not accidents. So injuries, illnesses, and fatalities are not accidents. They are the results of decisions, usually decisions made by management. One quick example from research we are doing for this year's Dirty Dozen report, which I'll share more about that, on unsafe employers. A worker died last August after being pulled into a machine at a company called Great Lakes Polymer Technologies in Kingman, Kansas. When OSHA investigated, they found a piece of duct tape covering the safety interlock. Someone put that duct tape there. It prevented the machine from shutting down, and that's why a worker lost their life. So there are different words you could use to describe the situation. I would not use accident. It sounds more like gross negligence. It might even meet the legal definition of manslaughter. And as I mentioned, definitely not an accident. Someone made a decision, someone took an action, and a worker is dead. So in our experience shows that when you look closely, there is almost always a decision and or an action that leads to almost every workplace illness, injury, or fatality. And we urge you to keep that in mind when looking at these kind of incidents. These events are not accidents or freak occurrences. Whether you are a journalist or an advocate, I think we all agree that words matter. We have some thoughts which we captured in a best practices document about the most appropriate language to use when reporting on workplace deaths, illnesses, and injuries. And we're going to share that with everyone here today as a link, but we'll also share it as follow-up to this session. We, as Melissa also mentioned earlier, we'll share all these resources and make sure that you have them to share among your colleagues, and as a good reminder for yourself. So we also want to note an important opportunity for media attention that's coming up around worker injuries and fatalities, which is Workers' Memorial Week, which takes place this year from April 23rd through April 30th. During that week of events commemorating the toll of dangerous workplaces all over the world, there's an opportunity to hear worker testimonies directly from workers, an opportunity to hear about ongoing campaigns that is looking to change that reality for workers as well. So, and here at National Kosh, we will release our annual Dirty Dozen report, which focuses on 12 of the worst employers in the US as nominated by our large network. And that report will be released on Wednesday, April 26th at 2 p.m. We've had several big corporations be part of that Dirty Dozen, unfortunately, including Amazon, Starbucks, many others. And we want to, we'll release who those are this year for 2023. As I said, it'll highlight the employers who put workers at grave risk due to unsafe practices. We'll have a press briefing on the 26th, and we'll make sure all of you receive that invitation. So as you see on the slide, if you want to take a quick note of that, put it on your calendar. And with that, I hope you found this program useful and that it will be helpful to you as you continue your articles and investigations. If you can take a minute, we're dropping a quick poll to help us evaluate today's session in the chat. If you have a minute, please take a look and respond. It'll help us make this program better. As Melissa said, we want to continue to be a resource for you as you work on these issues, which can be very complex. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions about anything that came up today or any questions about stories you are working on today. I also want to highlight that we are a multilingual network. Just at National Kosh, we offer many resources, testimony, and interviews in English and Spanish, and we will share by email the slides from today's presentation. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And that concludes our program. So I'm going to now, again, just let us know when the poll is up for any feedback. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
So, Melissa, will you be releasing the poll?
It's not showing up as an option.
Okay. All right. Well, Jesse, do we have a poll? Do you know?
Let's see here. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Yeah, Melissa has to do it. Sorry.
Okay, great. We'll just take 1 minute. And then we'll send a follow-up evaluation too.